Well, we have to take a risk. Right? We have to put ourselves out there if we want change. If you're not willing to take a risk, don't step out. Right? Because you can do anything and somebody's going to call you a racist today. Right? So my name is Samuel Paul Bryant. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in Phoenix. The name of our discussion tonight, I'm just calling it a discussion on racism in America in 2020. There's a concept I want to start with, and it's kind of the core concept that I want to get across to you guys today. And I call that concept African American burden. What you want to contrast that with is this thing that we hear a lot called white privilege. So
fragility.
So I want to give you a concept of African American burden, talk to you about myself and what I've experienced, in particular around the murder of George Floyd, and see if you can't try to empathize with my story. Ethnic burden. The pressure, anxiety, trauma that an African American experiences based on his understanding of the history of oppression and injustice of his ancestors that is triggered by current perceptions of racial injustice. I want to acknowledge and offer my time even here today to you in honor of all my ancestors who came to America first as slaves and experienced many injustices from slavery through Jim Crow, through other repressive acts that have happened. I grew up gaining a knowledge of my ancestry in America. It looked kind of like this. Number one, I grew up on welfare. I'm the last of my mom's 13 children. My mom grew up in the South. She had what I call a 6th grade Mississippi education, so she was functionally illiterate. I didn't grow up with a dad. So imagine me, I look like this guy, I'm in the 8th grade, and we're watching videos, right, films, back then we didn't have videos, of civic unrest in the 60s and so on. I'm usually the only black person in the class, so I'm sitting there, I'm watching a video. Black people are being treated horribly, attacked by dogs, sprayed with water hoses, glimpses of black people hanging from trees after being lynched, right? You're watching all this. This is forming my identity. I'm saying this is my history as an African American. This is a part of my legacy. And I'm watching it, what am I experiencing? I'm experiencing trauma. I feel helpless. I feel helpless to help my ancestors. There's nothing I can do for them. There's no way to protect them. I feel angry enough to look at a white person and think, should I attack this person right now? Right? Are you guys following me there? These are the things that are, this is in the 8th grade. And before that, I have had other images of African Americans that have been presented to me. Right? In the 70s, if you turn on most TV shows, black people were athletes if you saw them on TV. If they were in a show, they were drug addicts or criminals. That was the norm. You rarely saw black professionals. I'm 55 years old, so in the 70s, you rarely saw black professionals. I would argue you rarely see black professionals in the media today, right? I mean, can you guys think of a, right, even in a TV show, right? Not the Cosbys. Right? You kind of follow me? So imagine a young man growing up. I remember, I think Roots came out sometime in that time period too. You guys, some of you young people don't even know what Roots is probably. Late 70s. When it came out, it was the big deal. But even I remember growing up watching Roots, giving me an idea of what my ancestors suffered in America at the hands of white people. I don't really like that phrase, white person. White to me is defining people by skin color. I think that's a very modern thing. It's not historical. But until I become more eloquent, I'm using the word white American, Caucasian American, and so on. So imagine learning all this, watching it, experiencing it, having to embrace it, and then let's just fast forward. I'm online or somewhere, or TV, and the George Floyd thing happens. The murder happens, right? I'm looking at it. What do you think I see? What I see is a white man oppressing a black man until he dies. So in my mind, what does it trigger? It triggers the injustice that I understand my ancestors have suffered at the hands of white people over the course of years. So I am traumatized, right? It triggers in me trauma. Right? I mean, even right now as I talk about it, I've got goosebumps. I mean, you can actually see them, right? Because it's traumatizing. Now, of course, it could be traumatizing for you too, because it's an inhumane act that we're watching, right? I think the difference for a black person is this trigger, though, right, that I call African American burden. It triggers in me my history, the history of my ancestors in America that have been oppressed. So I have to confront my burden. So that's all I want you to understand. This is not the only story, right? I've asked almost every African American client that has come in, how are you doing with the George Floyd incident? I asked one African American, what did you see when you saw the George Floyd incident? He said, I saw my son being treated that way. I saw my father. I saw my grandfather. Right? I saw my ancestors. Right? So imagine imagine what that man is going through. That's one story. Another story, I had an African American come in very traumatized, meaning very hyperactive. You know, he was clearly disturbed by the incident, trying to find his way. How do I respond? He expressed something to the effect that there's some type of racism. But then he said something I thought was peculiar. He said, I want to sue the media outlets that traumatized me over and over again by producing and reproducing this video. I think it was before the George Floyd incident. I was talking to another African American client. He had been to prison, very rough upbringing. Probably like you guys could not imagine. He said to me something that really made a lot of sense. He goes, I don't doubt that every African American male in particular has suffered some type of post-traumatic stress disorder because of racial issues and how black people are portrayed in the media. Just think about that, and when you go home tonight, Google PTSD symptoms, and then maybe it'll start to make some sense to you why some African Americans respond the way they do. They're traumatized and incited. Here are some other examples of that burden. So imagine as an African American, I work in a place, I'm a professional, I've got a master's degree, I'm a woman, and I've been there for 11 years. I have a meeting with my superior and a lesser. I'm talking to my superior trying to get some information. This other person, who's white, speaks disrespectfully, the black woman feels to her. So she doesn't even pay her any mind. She continues to talk to her superior. This other person chimes in again, right? So she responds, right? She's a little indignant and she responds. She gets written up by her superior for being aggressive. What do you think if you're a black woman that means? You're aggressive. Well, there's a phrase called the angry black woman, right? It's like a prejudicial to, black women are angry, right? So she feels isolated. She's the only black person. She asks herself the question, wow, am I being treated this way because I'm a black woman? Do you see the burden? I'm sure, have you guys ever asked yourself, wow, am I being treated unjustly or rudely or inappropriately because I'm white? No, you probably never have had that. You've probably never even been in a place where you're not in the majority. Do you see? I'm giving you another picture of what an average black person, an average African American might go through in any situation, right? So, After the George Floyd thing, I remember hearing something like a black person on television saying something to the effect of, "I'm afraid to send my kids to school because I'm afraid they may get hurt or attacked by a police officer." When I first heard that, I was like, that is outrageous. How did we get there? How did we, in my mind, this is what I'm thinking. Then I have a client come in who says to me, "I'm so anxious that I'm afraid to send my kids to school." Now that's a whole nother story. Now I'm sitting with a human being that's traumatized, right? Who's actually afraid to send their kids to school. It's horrible. I think I'm giving you an idea of the concept of African American burden. I'm trying to contrast that with this concept of white privilege. I'm trying to do that for two reasons. I would suggest it's important as Caucasian Americans to be open to being compassionate to hearing other people's story without prejudgment, without assuming you know everybody's story or this individual story. If these opportunities arise for you, right? In the natural ongoing of your day, you know, if you happen to own a company and you have some African American employees, maybe you want to sit down and talk to them. Say, "Hey, I'm concerned about what's going on. Can you talk to me about, share with me your story. How is this affecting you?" Don't presume to know the answer for them or to give them answers to how they need to deal with it. Right? Just listen to their story. In America, we have a crisis of listening. It's an absolute crisis. I deal with it in my office every day. We do not listen well. So many of us as Americans are going around with, well, I call it emotional constipation, right? In order for us to be relieved, I need to be able to talk to someone, and I need some type of affirmation from that person I'm talking to. If I don't get that affirmation, it's kind of like the gift that just comes back to me, and it gets stuck in there. Does that make sense? So I am suggesting the beginning of healing for us as individuals, for the African American community, is individual. But anyway, I had affirmation. Little segue, how are we doing?
How do you go from, like you mentioned in the workforce, how do you go in the workforce and have an interaction? What's your story?
I think it would be organic, right? Sitting down, just starting a conversation with someone, asking them to lunch, being vulnerable yourself, and saying, you know, I'm really confused about what's going on. You know, the George Floyd murder, I'm hearing all kinds of things. Can you share with me what your thoughts are? Would you mind me sharing with you? Right? You'll talk to some people and they'll tell you all, they'll never ask you what your feelings are or your thoughts about. So I think it's important to ask, hey, can I share with you what's going on with me?
How do you do that and not be labeled racist?
She's saying, well, how do you actually approach, let's just say an African American in the workplace or in your community, without being labeled a racist? Well, we have to take risk, right? We have to put ourselves out there if we want change. If you're not willing to take a risk, don't step out, right? Because you can do anything and somebody's going to call you a racist today, right? Any questions, any more insights on that? How do we actually go about talking to an African American about race in America? I think you might find people in the workplace in these settings that are natural, organic, very open to talking. I mean, I think you might. The question is, right? If I'm empathetic with someone, does that mean I have to agree with them? No. I teach that all the time to my couples. You can be empathetic with your husband or wife, but that doesn't mean you agree with what they're telling you to do. That's not the way it works. So let's say, for example, you engage African American in a conversation, and they're talking, and they're saying, you know, yeah, I've gone through a lot of trauma, and this is why I support Black Lives Matter, because this is my response. You may say something like, oh, tell me about Black Lives Matter. Why do you support it? What has Black Lives Matter done for the African American community? I want to know, right? Because if it does good, I'd want to support it, right? Especially in these times, I would want to show solidarity for racial injustice. And I'm not saying it's your job or you need to do this or somehow you're racist. I'm just saying, hey, if it's in your life, if the Lord presents you with an opportunity and you want to take it, right? I think it's going to be good for you, right? It's going to open your heart like I'm hoping your heart is opening now, right? Just hearing my story. These are the types of things that I deal with. Does that make sense? Here's another part of my story that's really important to understand. I think most of my family was conservative growing up. I'm pretty confident my mom voted for Ronald Reagan. And nobody in my house ever told me anything like, because you're black, you're never going to succeed or do anything good. Racism is going to keep you down. The man is going to keep you down. I never heard that growing up. I just grew up with my mom, and I never heard that. Right? But that was kind of bred into me growing up. Even growing up on welfare and poor, we still had those ideas. What we want to understand is there are people with other upbringings who have been told since they were this young that they'll never add up to anything because they're black. So one day, my friend, a white guy, was doing like Boys and Girls Club of America or something. He was reaching out to young kids. So he invited me to a Phoenix Suns game with 3 young African American kids. I think they were siblings. The girl, I think she was 15 and pregnant with their second baby. And then I think the kid was 10. Things seemed pretty normal. We went to the game. Everything was okay. We talked, hung out, did whatever. On the way home, this kid, he must have been 8 or 10 years old. I was about 20. Starts lighting into me. I'm going to say some words that are probably inappropriate.
Probably never heard this.
You ain't nothing but a N-word. You ain't never going to be anything more than an N-word. And I don't care how many white people you hang out with, you ain't never going to be more than an N-word. This kid, out of nowhere, I'm 20 years old, out of nowhere, starts lighting into me. Well, where did he hear that from?
Well,
His world, his surrounding, his family, something in his environment was teaching him that, right? So in order to be empathetic, I need to understand that some people have some pretty horrible stories. Some people from a young age, some African Americans have been kind of fed this story, right? That you can never climb out of poverty. The man is always going to hold you down. You can't be successful unless you're, a famous athlete or whatever, right? You may run across somebody like that that is really struggling, that's really traumatized.